Good morning or good afternoon, depending where you're based. My name is Claudia and I'm with the Marcus Evans Group. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar. On the next wave of R&D, gains will come from insights management technology, brought to you in partnership with Within3. Before I begin, I would like to walk you a few housekeeping items. As you can see at the bottom of your screen, there are multiple application widgets you can use. All the widgets are resizable, movable, so feel free to go ahead and move them to get the most out of your desktop space, or perhaps your mobile if you're using as a device. On today's webinar, we have multiple resources available to you. All of the resources are downloadable, so make sure you can download those and share it with your colleagues. And if you need to access to any other further information, you will have the contact details after today's event. We have entered a quick survey. It's very briefly, I believe we have 4 or 5 questions entered. It's very important for us to understand what sort of topics you want to listen next, whether you enjoy this topic, if it's anything that we miss out perhaps. So go ahead and answer that survey that is very short and available to you. With that, I do not want to delay anymore. We have a great panel lineup for today. I'm going to hand it over to Lance, who's going to be moderating today. Thank you.
Thanks, Claudia. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. My name is Lance Hill. I'm the CEO and founder of Within3, and I'm really excited to be on the webinar today and moderate this panel, which is an amazing panel, which we will introduce here in a second. But just by way of background for me and my company, so Within3 is a company that analyzes in real time huge amounts of community data, as well as provides interactions with stakeholders throughout a disease community to help companies gain better insights. And so we do that for the smallest of biotechs that are way pre-approval and early stage R&D, all the way through the largest global manufacturers in med device and med tech. So we have a lot of experience with this topic. And are excited to bring that perspective as a technologist. My personal background is I am a technologist, so I really enjoy figuring out ways that technology can make healthcare better and drug development through commercialization specifically better. I've been doing that for well over 20 years now. So that's a little bit about me. Before I introduce the panel, what I will say by way of disclaimer is all the views that you're going to hear on the webinar today are the views of the individual panelists, not necessarily of their companies, I guess perhaps with the exception of my views, which may in fact be the views of my company. But beyond that, the normal disclaimer applies. So I thought what I could do before getting into the topic is really start off and have the panel introduce themselves. We can go left to right on the screen, maybe start off with Jill.
Great, thanks, Lance. Hello, everyone. My name is Jill Curdy. I am called a global operations head. Essentially, I work with a lot of the operations team members across the oncology organization to execute our portfolio of early assets. So early meaning taking things pre-NME to phase 2 or registration sometimes in oncology. So I'm happy to be here. Thank you, Lance, for including me in this exciting discussion.
All right, and Allison?
Yeah, thanks, Lance. Hi, I'm Allison Kemner. I am a VP of Clinical Sciences and Operations, now stationed at Tyra Biosciences. My background is in nursing, and I started in the bone marrow transplant world at University of Pennsylvania in the middle of Philadelphia. And once I completed my my graduate studies, transitioned into pharmaceutical development, moving from some of the largest organizations to the smallest biotech companies. And as part of that experience, I've had the opportunity to work in or on multiple submissions and devote quite a significant amount of time to Asia, working in studies there. So I've had the luxury of being able to work across many different types of the clinical development spectrum.
Great. Jennifer.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. It's so nice to see you. I'm Jennifer Lee, Senior Vice President of Clinical Operations, Data Management, and Biostatistics at Elevar Therapeutics. Elevar is an oncology company in rare disease space. I lead pharma and biotech companies to accelerate drug development pipelines from preclinical to commercialization stages. I've successfully contributed to the approvals of 7 novel treatments in the past, leading to labeling changes, licensing agreements, and market registrations. I work for top 50 pharma companies as well as startup companies in the past. And my background is in biochemistry, and I have master's degrees at Northwestern University in regulatory compliance. I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you.
Welcome. And Jay.
Sure. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So Jay Russick, Senior Director here of Clinical Operations at Keros Therapeutics. I've been in the industry for about 15 years, started off on the site side and jumped over to the dark side of industry. I've worked at companies including Biogen, Sage Therapeutics, Dicerna, and now here. Always been within the R&D clinical development side of the space, have worked across phase 1 through phase 4 trials, both domestic and large global trials. I've had the pleasure of working on several successful NDA programs, but also taking it back to more the early stage. So pretty broad spectrum of within the clinical development space, and really happy to be here this morning and talk about this exciting topic.
All right, thanks, Jay. So let's jump in. So by way of format for this webinar, I'm going to go ahead and set the stage with some high-level sort of information. We're really going to be talking about 2 things today. We're going to be talking about insights management technology and some of the technologies that are impacting the R&D space over, say, the next 5 years that we think are going to make some very significant gains for companies. But also we're going to overlay that with the discussion around diversity and inclusion, which is a very hot topic, as we all know, in the clinical and R&D space. And I think fusing those 2 things together hopefully will make for a really interesting discussion. So what we're going to do is we'll go through and I'll set the stage. We'll have some panel discussion. Then about halfway through, I'm going to talk about 4 technologies just from an educational point of view that we see really impacting a lot of what we're going to be talking about. And then we'll finish with panel discussion as well. So hopefully a fun kind of format throughout. If you need to ask or want to ask questions, you can absolutely do that through the Q&A interface. We will have time at the end to answer questions. I will also try, if I can, to intersperse questions if I see them coming in along the way of the discussion. But if not, we'll try to get to as many as we can at the end. And obviously, any questions that don't get answered because we run out of time or et cetera, you can follow up directly at within3.com and we can get those answered and get back to you. So let's go ahead and maybe set the stage a little bit. So I mentioned, at the outset that, Within3 is a technology company, and we spend a lot of, millions of dollars in R&D trying to help life science companies be more effective and get drugs to market faster. And so where I thought we would start is really look at what the in technology investment has been in the life sciences space. And what you see from 2018 to 2023 projected is a massive increase in the R&D investment that's happening in the clinical study space. That's growing year over year over year. And the technology investment is following that as well from a software companies, what companies like Within3 and many, many others are investing. Our level of R&D is also increasing year over year over year into the space to try to help companies be more effective and efficient. But what's really interesting is when you look at data, and this data is from Informa Connect and Regulatory Affairs Professional Society, is that when you look at the challenges from 2016, broadly speaking, and the challenges through 2021, they're very similar. A lot of the technology investment has gone into workflow and automation and data capture, data analysis, big data analysis, things that have made kind of the operational side better within clinical studies, but you still see consistent issues around productivity, lack of personnel, issues with site enrollment, issues with sites being trials being on time and studies being on time throughout. And so the technology investment still has a very similar sort of result. And for example, if you look at this slide, you can see that over less than half of the companies that were surveyed here believe that their site enrollment processes are successful. And almost 80% believe that the site productivity, there's a lot of room for opportunity within the productivity of their studies. And so these pervasive challenges, in light of even all this investment, create a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of rationale why. What we see is that a lot of the technology investment that I mentioned really went towards, as I mentioned, automation, data, analysis, those sorts of things. But what really hasn't happened is technology around people. So one thing that is pervasive throughout studies, throughout all phases, is the people that are involved and the insights and the ability to bring those people and those insights together, whether we're designing studies, whether we're talking about patients and patient interaction, all throughout, whether we're in approval process. And so there's a wave of technology that is really focused on how can we enable people and democratize R&D in a stronger way, allow more voices at the table in a way that those voices produce better results. And that's really where some of the insights management technology comes in that I'm going to talk about a bit later. But what we're going to do is really talk about these problems in terms of involving people in the R&D process and getting access to insights people through the lens of diversity and inclusion. And so if you think about where we are, there's still, and we'll have some data here in a bit, there's a vast gulf in the representative populations of clinical studies throughout the life science organization relative to the actual percentages of populations by ethnicity or other sorts of segmentation. And that really is through study design, selection, enrollment, pretty much through the entire process. And so there's a large focus, I think, as everyone knows, with the FDA here in the United States specifically, to really try to drive more diversity and inclusion into the R&D process. And that has very different implications depending on the size of company you are, the therapeutic area you're in, et cetera. So that's kind of the backdrop. What I thought I'd do very quickly is launch a quick poll. And so the poll is, how would you rate your organization's readiness to improve your DEI approach to trial design recruitment? So is your organization very ready on this topic, somewhat ready, or not ready? And I'll give folks a couple of minutes to go ahead and answer that. Okay, so just looking at that data, somewhat ready seems to be, I think, where the majority of folks are. And I think that's probably pretty accurate, that I think most companies have been doing something around this area, but there's still kind of a lot more to go. And that's evidenced by just looking at one therapeutic area. An example is in oncology. Less than 10% of patients enrolled in oncology trials tend to be minority. And that's obviously very out of whack versus the overall population footprint within the United States. And so this is a persistent problem, and we as an industry have to figure out how to address that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over and begin the panel conversation. And I'll call on maybe Allison first. Maybe Allison, if you could talk a little bit about how you view this topic, what it means for your organization, and some of the challenges that you wrestle with, that would be really, really wonderful.
Sure. So I guess I've had the benefit of being dedicated and really committed to diversity, inclusivity, trial access for many years. And one of the things, of course, the focus on it right now is extraordinary, and certainly different than it was 2 or 3 years ago. But one of the things that I find very interesting always is that there's not a lot of research actually around what's the best way to break down the barriers to help patients access clinical trials. We're focused on it here at my organization, and I'm lucky to be leading that effort. And so we are doing things that we hope will help break down barriers and enable access to patients in a community that don't typically have access to the services of the clinical trial centers, which I would add are usually, especially in an oncology setting, large academic centers, which can create their own set of barriers due to the complex nature of the institution, and even barriers that limit access based on the availability of insurance by the person going to the center. There's some centers that still just have a wall that doesn't allow patients actually to even in the door. So some of the things that we're doing are focused on engagement. Of course, we want to know what those barriers are. And I think that's actually a common theme that you'll see a lot of people doing is talking more with patients, bringing it back into the clinical development space. So it's not just focused on the post-marketing setting. You're doing it much, much earlier in the development pipeline so that you can bring those learnings into the clinical trial. And when I say that, I mean that you're actually taking those conversations and looking at your in- and exclusion criteria, your schedule of assessments, and modifying them so that patients feel the trial is more accessible to them. So that's some of the things that we're doing.
So Jay, you're in the ultra rare disease space, correct? That's a very different headset, I would think, in terms of trying to wrestle with this issue. How do you approach interacting with humans throughout the R&D process versus data, and especially with a lens towards diversity and inclusion?
Sure, yeah. So coming off of an ultra rare program at my prior role, it is different, right? So the FDA has released multiple guidance documents, the latest just a few months ago in April, and they do recognize. I think they understand that when they set the guidance for sponsors to think about diversity and inclusion in our clinical development plans, that it's not a one-size-fits-all. But I think we all strive, regardless of the indication that we're working on, to ensure that we do the best we can. When we talk about rare disease or ultra rare disease, there are a lot of factors that maybe exclude you from being as diverse as when you start talking about other indications such as oncology, cardiovascular, diabetes, et cetera. So you have to keep in mind what is the disease background. That's part of the guidance document. That's actually the suggested part 1 of that diversity plan that you're now required as a sponsor to submit at some point during the development phase to the FDA, is asking you to outline what is the background of the disease, calling out that, if it is, let's say, autosomal recessive genetic disease, that maybe it just hasn't impacted as many different, ethnicities as some of the more common diseases are. So that is definitely step 1, is understanding your patient population and what's really achievable. Maybe, you could spend years making sure that you have the representation and have a more diverse background, but then you're delaying a treatment potentially moving forward. So you have to find that right balance, in my opinion. And I think the FDA agrees with that.
So Jennifer, you're also in a kind of in a smaller biotech space right now. How do you think about this issue?
I absolutely agree with what Jay said. Understand your population, especially in rare disease. We have a very limited population to begin with, but some of these rare diseases are devastating physically and emotionally and mentally. And interesting fact, as we all know, that about 39% of the U.S. population represent minorities, Yet in clinical trials, there's only 1 to 5% from African American community and Latino community representing our clinical trials. And how do we get to these communities to make sure that they have opportunity to assess the clinical trials as their options? And I think one of the things is to partner with the KOLs so that they understand what options that are available, and partner with the technology vendors such as Within3 to understand some of the challenges, but also the benefits that it provides. Incorporating AI or decentralized clinical trials or technology solutions will reach wider population, and it provides convenience. If a patient comes in with a debilitating physical pain, they can come to clinic on a monthly basis, right, and go through scans and then move over to a pharmacy to get their drug dispensed, and then move over to the clinical laboratory to get their PK blood drawn. So I think incorporating the technology is really important, but understanding the disease population and the needs and the challenges from the get-go, I think would be really important.
So Jill, in a way, you're on a different end of the spectrum, in that Janssen's a very large company. I understand that you spend a lot of your time earlier in the study development process. How do some of these issues affect the way you look at the world?
We actually are struggling, like Jay had indicated. If you think about a first-in-human trial, you may only have a couple of patients in these early escalation cohorts. So our focus has to be balanced. We want to get that answer of whether we have a drug or not as quick as we can, but we also have to be able to know if it is a patient population like multiple myeloma, like prostate cancer, that is way more impacted in the African American community. We want to make sure we have those patients in those early dose cohorts, because they're the ones who are going to be needing this drug the most. So we, as a company, we are super focused in creating the diversity plans. We have a lot of discussion about the FDA guidance, because it says, before your end of 2 meeting. And so, in oncology, you may go to registration with phase 1 data. So we want to have that plan in place very early. So maybe not in that first couple of cohorts, but we have it ready to go as soon as we have an expansion. And, what could that look like? We've heard from Allison, we look at time and event schedules. We look at inclusion-exclusion criteria. We're looking at that holistically across. Are we, subconsciously excluding patients? We're working a lot in our contract language, trying to go with these fully loaded budgets so we don't rely on insurance companies. But I think it was also Allison who said some sites have such rigid processes that they don't want to go with that. And so the other side of it is, maybe we can't be at, Memorial Sloan Kettering, but there's satellite sites all over may be able to work with us a little bit better, and they may be able to filter the patients to us. So identifying these satellite sites is another area that we're trying to say, where are the diverse investigators who are going to draw and make sure that their patients have visibility to their options. So a little bit about what we're doing from the large pharma side, but I think it's very similar to what the colleagues in the biotech industry are doing as well.
So maybe I'll just open up to whoever on the panel wants to jump in. So, the guidance that Jay, that you mentioned in April, are you seeing really big shifts based on that guidance in terms of how you're going to develop therapies, or these are things that kind of sort of we're doing, the guidance is helpful, adds a little bit of process, but isn't necessarily a game changer in your outlooks?
So I wanted to jump on also what Jill said, and then I'll definitely answer that question. So I think I was looking at the attendee list. There's a lot of us represented in the industry on this call, and I'm sure many that will watch after, hopefully. I think it's on all of us as well to really challenge the sites. I think site access is a big deal here. We know there's data out there that patients from diverse backgrounds go to see care providers in their community. They don't go to the big academic centers. They're in the smaller sites that are unfortunately are research naive. And I think historically, as an industry, we've been challenged to bring on research naive sites that potentially lowers the quality of the data, causes a lot more operational issues, and requires a lot more oversight from our site. But we have to challenge ourselves to be willing to take that risk and find that new balance. I think so. To answer your question, Lance, this follow-up question, I think it is. I think it's going to be slow to. I think right now it's causing all of us. I think the updated guidance is causing all of us to take pause, reevaluate what we're doing. I think some of it we have all been doing in one way or another. I think how much of it is a checkbox versus how much are we actually following up and doing what we're saying we're going to do. I think that's often a struggle if we all are honest. And in a lot of our plans is we have these well laid out plans, but then how much actually becomes a reality, because we're doing research in humans and things happen and we're under a lot of different pressures. So I think the guidance is I think we're at the forefront of seeing some, I would hope, substantial change on some practices. And for me, one of them is really opening up what sites we are willing to work with in a clinical trial setting.
And if I can add on, I think I fully align with Jay. And from my perspective, we have to make that investment and start working with these sites and train them on how to do clinical research. And as you said, I work in early, so some of that research is really restricted to centers who can handle the potential side effects. So we're working with Stand Up to Cancer, and I know that's not an option for everyone, but trying to get the focus more on how can we develop these sites, how can we train them, how can we groom them to be able to give us that quality. And the other thing, I'll just go back to what your question was, are we ready or are we doing anything different today? I think the big difference is we're trying to measure all of this work that we've talked about. We've been implementing little by little. Now it's, have we been successful? And if we're not seeing that success, what else can we do? And I think that's where we're all today, is adding that what else, because we're seeing maybe little bits of success, but I don't think we're seeing the success we all hoped we'd see. So now we're adding on, what else can we all do collectively as an industry to continue to make these improvements in the patients we're getting into our trials.
Yeah, Jill, you just brought up a really good point, because one of the things that is always in the back of my mind is that none of us are going to be able to solve this issue alone. But the collective focus of the industry right now, I'm hopeful that we will start to see a shift. And I think, to Jay's point, I don't know that we're doing a lot of things that are differently. I think you're right, Jill. We are measuring it now, but bringing it earlier into the development pipeline, I think, is new. Operations and enrollment, it has always kind of been sort of secondary, right, to the science and the protocol. And it's sort of like, well, here's the protocol, now go enroll it. And so there hasn't really been a lot of attention given to best practices for how do we break down those barriers? How do we augment access? How do we help patients find, join, and stay on a study? And so now we have an agency behind that and causing us to, as Jay said, take pause and really consider what are the things that we're doing and are they working? And hopefully in the next few years, we'll figure out some of those pieces of the puzzle and what are we doing that works well and not, and abandon the things that aren't and keep the things that are, like we would in any scientific study, and then continue to do those to break down some of the issues. And I also saw a question down here around, are we only focusing on race and ethnicity? And I don't think that we are. I know we're not. I mean, when you do talk about decentralization, I think, Jill, you were talking about it, right? That, you do need to consider, where are these patients sitting? And I also would posit that in oncology, we're always now talking about rare diseases because we're really talking about precision medicine and breaking down the big populations of patients into very small, narrow subgroups who have a particular genetic marker or genomic mutation, which does make it more difficult. And so we need to be opening up or widening our net or expanding the pool of sites, and then evaluating how do we best access patients, or how do we allow patients to access the clinical trials where they're being run so that they can receive the proper oversight, especially for the early phase studies.
And it might mean that we cut some of the long-term extensions because the patients can't keep coming back every couple of weeks for a visit, or we have nurses going to their house, or we provide transportation for the patients to get to and from the clinic. So I think all hands are on deck right now, and every idea is a good one. And now it's just, to continue to measure the impact of each of these changes and continue bringing up new ones. I think decentralized trials is really going to help us with this population that may be more challenged to get some to the big academic centers.
I agree. Protocol design is, I think, an important part of diversity and inclusion as well. It's not, yes, I focused on sites, but it's also really evaluating a protocol, the extension period, even some of the assessments, right? I think we all are guilty of adding on assessments because we want all that extra data. But each time you add on a more invasive or a imaging that can only be done at a bigger center, you're automatically excluding a part of this population that we're targeting. So can you get away with not having an MRI? Can you get away? So can we think outside the box on how we traditionally evaluate our outcomes and assessments, and do so in a way that is more inclusive? Those big tests to a lot of this population that we're talking about are ones that are scary, that they don't have access to. They have to go to different centers. So it is thinking about the protocol design too. Granted, some of us unfortunately need some of that assessments, but can we be creative? Can we just have a subset, a sub-study for, looking at that one imaging marker, and then the rest of the study, you don't need it, or things like that. So just a couple ideas, but it definitely goes beyond just at the getting access to the sites.
I think the introduction of the FDA guidance is really right step in the direction we're talking about it. And there are plenty of vendors that are now working towards help supporting our biotech and pharma industry to incorporate early, decentralized clinical trial design into our protocol, and we're talking about it. So I think we're making a good progress. I know there are some hurdles, and there are many, many services that comes with some of the challenges where, what are we going to do with the data that we collect for wearable, for example, where patients wear a handheld watch with him or her 24/7, and we collect data, and who owns that data? How do we protect to make sure that data is safe and transferred to our vendor, to our site, and to our sponsor, and who ultimately owns that? So there are many, many questions, but I think it's a really healthy debate, good conversations to have, and it's a good starting point. I think one of the things that I just wanted to mention is that we have adapted, our company, previous company adapted unknowingly the decentralized model during the pandemic. And we incorporated ePro as well as the visiting nurse, local hospital, healthcare visits, and so on. But I was wondering, who's open to the idea of pop-up health clinic just for patients? So I think what I see moving forward is we need to identify sites in these underrepresented communities, but we need to find patients and bring the clinical trials to the patients where they are, instead of bringing them to the clinical centers.
Yeah, Jennifer, that is such an, I know, I love that. Actually, that's really interesting. Because even, working in an inner city for many years in the hospital, it's just, patients don't go sometimes. They don't, it looks like the catchment's there, right? You could look at an inner city and say, well, this hospital serves this population of patients, if we're thinking about just cities right now. But a lot of those patients, they just don't access the big cancer centers, or they don't go to them. Or there's, as you mentioned, the MSKs, there might be some other, barriers there, that in terms of insurance. But having that ability to partner with local centers that are catering and serving the needs of the patients in their communities, we really do need to be focusing on how we're developing and reaching those particular centers, where the patients are going for care. And how do we set up the supports to make sure that we can conduct a trial that with rigor, so that the data that we do collect is reproducible and meets all the regulatory standards that we need to meet, and ensures the safety and appropriate oversight of the patients. But I think sponsors are putting to put it bluntly, I think companies are putting their money where their mouth is. I mean, I think we're seeing an adoption of concierge services. We're seeing an adoption of the decentralized effort. We are seeing more patient engagement. We're trying to understand much more deeply what are those barriers and how do we mitigate or get around them. I mean, my bias really is focusing a lot on the patient side, really focused on what are patients saying that they need, that they can, how can they access these trials? They are interested in it. It's not that they're not interested in it, but we need to understand if they're interested, why are they not enrolling? And we can only really get that through deep conversation. So I love the idea of the pop-up.
Yeah, that's a great segue into some technologies that are in coming and it really here, but you're going to see more and more discussion about in the coming years that can address a lot of the issues that were just raised, or at least be somewhat supportive. So we'll go ahead and I'll talk through four. I'm going to very briefly, and then kind of turn it back to the panel. But I want to make sure that hopefully this is educational, this kind of section of it. So we're going to talk about network analytics, social listening, asynchronous virtual engagement, and then life science trained natural processing, which is kind of a subset of artificial intelligence, and how these technologies are impacting some of the things that have been discussed in the last 20 minutes. So network analytics basically is the same sort of technology that the social media companies use when they're looking at all of their data to understand impact, influence, who's connected to who, how to reach certain populations or sets within a network. And these same sorts of technologies and mathematical models are being applied now into the life sciences space for a variety of purposes. And how those work, how network analytics work, is a lot of times what happens is when we look at, how do we do site selection? How do we identify potential candidates? A lot of times we'll get a data set from various vendors and it'll be kind of a ranking in a list. And that gives you a view. But what network analytics does is it begins to instead identify the broader network on top of an amalgamation of different data sets. So for example, if I'm looking at here are the top sites that treat certain types of patients, we talked about it, especially when we're talking about underrepresented communities. Oftentimes, access to those communities are not in those rankings. So going to the same people that we've always gone to and working with the same partners we've always gone to, oftentimes results in what we've seen, which is a great underrepresentation in the underserved community. And what network analytics does is actually try to understand how physicians are connected to each other, how patient populations are connected through physicians, to understand that if you look at the data this way, there are certain what we call trust brokers, certain folks who have access to and see different segments of population than would be visible if you just looked at it in a list. And those become the ability to drive what Jay was talking about, looking at maybe sites that traditionally aren't participating in clinical studies, looking at populations that perhaps aren't going through traditional academic centers and seeing how to target them. And in the diversity space, where this kind of science is now is, unfortunately in the US, we're still very, very segregated. And so zip code determines a lot in terms of what the population is anywhere in the United States and kind of what the ethnicity, socioeconomic, et cetera is. And so you can overlay everything in one network view, everything from claims data, who's typically having genetic testing done and who's not, who's looking at certain comorbidities and who's not. You can overlay that with deprivation data. So the NIH and University of Wisconsin published a deprivation index that measures a variety of things and ties that back to zip code. You can overlay that with census data, which lets you understand ethnicity and race, again, tied back to geolocation, and then tie all of that back to referral patterns and treatment patterns by physicians, and all in one view as an example. And what you get is an amazing map at where potential patients and sites might be and the healthcare professionals that are involved with those patients. It's kind of like taking a big needle in the haystack. It doesn't get it all the way down to the needle, but it certainly gets it down to a much smaller haystack to work with in a place where you can investigate. And this is all done by taking all of this data, putting it in a network and looking at impact, influence, and reach versus just ranks and lists of folks. So this sort of technology is really coming into play in the clinical and R&D space. A lot of organizations are really investing in these sorts of platforms. They're very accessible at this point. They're far less expensive than they used to be to kind of gather all the prerequisite data. A lot of different companies aggregate and provide these sorts of data, and so it's the analysis of this data that become very, very useful. So the next technology, and again, I'm going through this very, very quickly, is social listening. There was some discussion about hearing the voice of the patient that Allison was just talking about, and bringing the voice of the patient in. And also what happens a lot in segregated communities by ethnicity or race is that the discussion within the community is different than the broader discussion that might be averaged out across the entire U.S. Throughout, again, I think we talked about this, site access is a major obstacle to trial participation. And I think Allison just said very eloquently, it's not just time and distance. It's also influence and habit in terms of being able to go to different centers. So what social listening does is it really enables, if I can get there we go, perfect. What social listening does is these are platforms that can look and specifically target different populations across multiple social platforms, tag them by disease, keywords, all sorts of things, and really bring together very, very quickly analysis of who's talking about what online and how they're connected to each other as well. And you might find that there are leaders around certain topics. There are patient voices that are very loud. There are people very interested in driving certain types of diagnostics and testing. There are people from the non-life sciences side also trying to drive equity in healthcare. That could be important connections and contacts as you think about broadening your patient outreach. So social listening is really not a nice to have at this point. It really is so much of the public dialogue and debate happens online. And it's an immediate and wonderful source to get real interaction above the processes that you're already doing. And technology today takes the universe of social media and filters it down in real time to what matters to your specific area, and you can work with it. So the next technology I'm going to talk about really quick, and again, this is kind of the rapid fire technology section, is asynchronous virtual engagement. So if you look at how we talk about decentralized trials or how we engage patients or even sites and investigators for that matter, typically when we're doing things virtually, we're doing things with webinars like Zoom and the meeting that we're having now. Asynchronous communication is the idea of almost like what online universities do, that you can set up rooms that have content and interaction within them that patients in one context or investigators in another can log in their own time, interact with each other, interact with content, and have all that come back in a very structured way. And this sort of available whenever the patient can get there or whenever the investigator can get there in their schedules has a lot of advantages to trying to bring people together in real-time webinar sorts of timeframes. Silas Buchanan is the CEO of the Institute for E-Health and Equity. He uses our technology, part of the work that he does. But what he does is he has created a network of faith-based organizations. And so one way to reach the Black community in a life sciences context would be to work with his organization. And he is kind of one of those trust brokers, those connectors to hundreds of faith-based organizations. And as you know, in the Black community specifically, faith-based organizations have a very powerful influence, can help break down some of the stigma and barriers of working with industry. And his comment is here in that this sort of engagement eliminates time barriers. Folks in different socioeconomic circumstances may or may not be able to engage online synchronously in real time. It eliminates education barrier. It eliminates language barrier, a variety of things that make this sort of format a much better way to interact with patients oftentimes than putting people in front of a Zoom camera. We in industry, we probably, I'm sure like me, you spend all day in front of Zoom and Teams and these sorts of technologies. Oftentimes these populations do not. So asynchronous engagement technology and building that into one of the approaches that you reach the people that you're involved with is an important technology. And then the last one is AI. Just going through this, AI, I'm sure folks in the call are very familiar from the perspective of analyzing big data and that sort of thing. There's a different flavor of artificial intelligence that is really focused on analyzing the insights and information we get back when we're talking to people or pulling information from people from things like social listening and et cetera. And so AI, broad topic, a subset of AI is machine learning. Machine learning is kind of the ability for AI to kind of listen and learn on its own. And then deep learning is trying to teach AI to think like a human. And part of deep learning is where natural language processing comes in. This is Siri and Alexa and so forth, where I can hear a human phrase and deconstruct that phrase into parts and pieces of things that matter. And so AI in the life sciences space is becoming very good, and I apologize for the formatting on the slide, but AI is becoming very, very good at taking free text inputs from patients, from investigators, from online, and processing and analyzing that in a way that's easy to work with. Becomes very important in larger studies, especially. But the technology now has been being trained over the last several years and is really coming to the forefront. And this helps organizations gather and integrate information very, very quickly and make faster decisions. So those are the 4 technologies that I wanted to talk about briefly. They will all have an impact on the discussion that we have here. But let's go back to the panel. So I'd like to kind of open it up to everybody. Where do you think we're headed, and where, as you think about the role that technology can play, do you feel will be 3 years, 5 years out?
I think we need to dive in more to the patient voice. We've heard from our investigators that are doing our clinical research that they want to say in building the protocol. And I think, using the kind of technology, those platforms where people can go in and sort of on their own time add their feedback has been used or maybe is being used for investigators and doctors that are working on our clinical trials. But I love the idea of getting patients. We're used to having patient panel discussions, but just like on this call, some people are happy to speak, some people are a little shyer to speak, some people are shyer to ask questions. It's the same on a patient panel. So I think, Lance, what you showed would be amazing for some of these diseases that we're really trying to learn from the patients what you'd be willing to do. What are you willing to get in terms of a treatment, or what is holding you back from doing a trial like this? Those kinds of insights, I think people would be very open to share in a platform such as one of the ones you showed us.
Yeah, I agree, Jill. I think too that I think there'll always be a blend, because I think the technology has the capacity to reach a lot more people, a lot more voices. Certainly it can break down, I think too, some walls in other parts of the world where the challenges would be different. But one of the things that one thing that I think there's still tremendous value in having the face-to-face engagements as well. And Lance, you mentioned something, and I was thinking, you know, when we're using all of this information, we're getting a lot. You get a lot of data, right? A lot of information is coming in, and so it's incumbent upon us to understand how do we translate that so that we're actually doing something that makes our trials, you know, more available to patients and makes it easier for them. So, you know, bone marrow biopsies become liquid biopsies, or the primary endpoint might be adjusted, or maybe you add a secondary or a second primary endpoint or co-primary endpoint to better meet the needs of patients and make your trial more relevant for the patient population. We just had a meeting a couple weeks ago, face-to-face meeting with an advocacy group, and they just simply said, you know, can you just package your drug differently, because the side effects, the class effects of this drug make it hard for people to open a package. So can you just package your drug differently? That would make a huge difference. So having those conversations and then being able to interpret what that dialogue means, I think will be really critical in the next 5 years. We'll learn how to interpret this data much more efficiently, and then make some adjustments in our programs so that we can start early and make trials more relevant for patients.
Jay or Jennifer, what do you think? How is technology going to change the game as you see it in the next 3 to 5 years? Or at least impact the game. To Allison's point, it's never one either or. It's always a combination. But how do you feel that's going to affect things?
Yeah, so I mean, go ahead, Jennifer. Go ahead, Jennifer.
I think looking back when we changed from manual FDA submission applications to the technical document submissions, and then we also move away from the paper case report forms to electronic case report forms. It does take time. So I think it's going to take time for all of the industries, right? All of the companies, the patients and sites to adopt this new technology. So I think it's important for us to, take them along with us and help them see the value that technology can have on clinical trial design, the retention, enrollment, the patient burden, and overall quality of the patient's treatment options. At the same time, what I was thinking about is that FDA, they issue this guidance, but are they open to all of these, adoption of technologies that will be incorporated into the clinical designs? And then how about other countries, ex-US, Europe and Asia countries, are they open? We tried to one time advertise enrollment in Asia countries, and we weren't able to do that. So are they open and are they adaptive? And so those are some of the questions that will still come up, I think, in the next foreseeable future.
Yeah, so I agree with my fellow panelists and everything being said. Maybe a different take is, I think, thinking about harmonization and standardization. So as we are in this influx, and it's a good problem to have, but so many DCT companies, so many companies that are using AI to mine data, to look at data, whether it's patient identification, site identification, even how we analyze our data, right? And as there's this increased force, both here domestically and ex-US, to share all of our results and all of our data once trials end, and how we could really benefit from each other's data. But there's so much of it. So how do we do it in a smart way to find new drugs or to find new avenues? But there needs to be, I think, with all this increase in technology, I think we all need to come together and align on some standards and some harmonization. I do worry a little bit about what in 5 years the space looks like with so many different variations, and does it go against some of the other efforts that are being made to be more transparent, to be able to be more collaborative, to be able to provide patients more information up, in a easy to digest manner. While I love technology, I think there's so many benefits as we've discussed here, and I use almost everything that you've discussed on my clinical program today, right? So I think we're all using it, but I do think that there needs to be some efforts on the back end about how we harmonize a little bit as we move forward.
Yeah, one of the things that that's interesting, and I'm going to field a couple of questions here just from the Q&A, is what a lot of times happens with technologies. When new technology enters a space, it starts off and it's not yet built for purpose. And so it's kind of a capability, and people are trying to adapt it and massage it, and and sometimes you're hiring consultants to try to make it work. And then over time, it becomes more and more focused. And that's really, in my mind, a tipping point as where it can have broad impact, and it can help what you're talking about, which is standardization. Because at that time, everyone's kind of agreed on the best way to use these things, and you start to get more consistency across the industry. And I think some of the technology I talked about are kind of at that tipping point. One question in the chat is around kind of R&D, finding the usual suspects. We had a client that said, when we're looking at initiating things, we go to the STPs. I'm like, who are the STPs? The same 12 people. We go the same 12 people every single time, and those are our STPs. And struggling with this ability of how can I get to naive sites and things like that you were mentioning, Jay. Again, some of the technology and data that's available now isn't, here's a mountain of data, comb through it, but is now very precise. Here's a question I have. What are the naive sites that have, in areas that are represented by patients I care about, and the ability to hone that much quicker. The second question is around the asynchronous technology, and that it's used really heavily for things like advisory boards and medical affairs and commercial, kind of later in the chain. But there's different applications designed for study design, protocol design, submission, patient engagement within R&D. So like in our world, we have 40 different kind of apps or engagements that we use across these sets of technology, but they're built for purpose. They're not just kind of like, here's a generic thing. And that helps, helps the adoption curve. So I guess a final question, we have a couple of minutes left, is from a diversity and inclusion point of view, is there anything that you think will be different in terms of how we even think about that concept in a few years? Or do you think we'll still be kind of wrestling with some of the same sorts of definitional problems that we have today?
I'll do a quick 30 seconds on that and then pass the baton. I think we're going to see outcomes data. So I think a lot of people are adapting and adopting the guidance that's been coming out for many, many years. But I do think it's different now with this recent guidance and draft guidance that was released just this year, where you have a lot of companies really adopting it very aggressively, pulling it forward, and really putting a lot of things in place to try and ensure that their enrolled patient populations are representative of the patients who actually have the disease. But and so what I do think is that in the next 5 years, we'll have outcomes. So are these things that we're adopting, are they working? Do we see our patients, the populations of patients being reflected in our trials? So I think that's where we're going to be in 5 years. I don't know that we'll be. I hope that we keep going with it and we keep breaking down the walls. And as sponsors, we're all collectively focused on that. But yeah, so I'm excited to see what happens in the next 5 years. Yep.
Yeah, I think a really exciting thing. Go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, I think we're going to all learn from each other as well. So what has Allison's company, Jennifer's company, Jay's company done that has seen success? And I hope that the agency will help sort of share what is working, what is moving the needle, so that we can all apply things uniformly.
Well, thanks to the panel. We're at time. Thanks to the panel. This has been really, really interesting. Hopefully everyone in attendance or watching after on demand found it very, very interesting as well. It's such an important space. We have to get this right. There are so many patients that are not being reached that could be. There's such a wealth of just human capital that we can apply to this problem and democratize healthcare and improve getting the right treatments in the hands of the right patients. I'm personally extraordinarily excited for what the industry is doing and where we're headed. So thank you so much for everyone for participating. Again, if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out via our website, within3.com, and we will go ahead and respond to those or connect those back to the panel. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.